The IMF survives on chaos. Kingsman survives on code. One man has spent his entire career breaking every rule that exists. He's about to enter an organization where the rules are the weapon. Ethan Hunt can learn any language in 72 hours. He can fly any aircraft. He can become any person. But can he become a gentleman? Because inside Kingsman, if you can't pass the dinner table, you never reach the battlefield. Open on black screen silence for 2 seconds. Then a single sound of file being stamped classified. Let me ask you something. You've seen Ethan Hunt scale the Burj Khalifa with nothing but a pair of gloves and sheer willpower. You've watched him hold his breath underwater for 6 minutes. You've seen him ride a motorcycle off a cliff on purpose and somehow walk away from it. So what kind of mission actually scares a man like that? Not the ones with bombs, not the ones with assassins, not even the ones where his own government is trying to kill him. The missions that scare Ethan Hunt are the ones where he doesn't know what he's walking into. And this is the one where he knows almost nothing. It starts the way all IMF missions start. Quietly, unremarkably, a message that shouldn't exist, delivered through a channel that officially doesn't exist to an operative who, on paper, has been dead 3 times. The briefing is simple, brutally simple. There has been a breach. Nuclear launch codes, American, British, and French, have been sold. The buyer is a ghost. The seller is harder to explain. Now at this point, Ethan has heard everything. He's dealt with the syndicate, the apostles, rogue CIA directors, corrupt IMF chiefs. He's genuinely very hard to surprise. But then the next line of the briefing hits. The seller is an organization called Kingsman. And Ethan does something he almost never does. He goes completely still. Because here's the thing about Kingsman that you need to understand before anything else in this story makes sense. They don't exist. Not in any file, not in any database, not in any intelligence network on Earth, including IMF's, which is saying something because IMF's network spans 47 countries and operates in places that don't appear on maps. Kingsman has no digital footprint, no official budget, no government oversight, no United Nations presence, no NATO classification. They are, for all intents and purposes, a tailor shop. A very, very expensive tailor shop on Savile Row in London, which, if you don't know, is the most famous street for bespoke suits in the entire world. The kind of place where a single jacket costs more than most people's cars. The kind of place where the clientele includes kings, prime ministers, and billionaires who never appear on Forbes lists. It's called Kingsman. And behind that perfectly pressed, leather-smelling, oak-paneled front, behind the tape measures and the fitting rooms and the impeccably dressed staff, who will never raise their voice above a murmur, sits the most dangerous private intelligence network on the planet. Here's where it gets fascinating. Kingsman wasn't built by a government. It wasn't commissioned by a military. It was built by grief. After the First World War, after an entire generation of Europe's wealthiest, most powerful young men were wiped out in the trenches. The ones who survived looked around and asked a question that nobody in power wanted to answer. Who protects the world when the governments that are supposed to protect it are the ones destroying it? So they built their own answer. An independent intelligence agency, funded by old money, answerable to no one, operating under a code that made their structure unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. Their agents are named after the Knights of the Round Table: Galahad, Lancelot, Percival, Merlin, Arthur. Think about what that means for a second. These aren't code names designed for anonymity. They're titles, They carry weight. They carry history. When Kingsman names you Galahad, you aren't just an agent anymore. You are the continuation of something centuries old. You carry the expectation of every Galahad who came before you. That's not a spy agency. That's a knighthood with firearms. And their weapons. Oh, their weapons are something else entirely. Because Kingsman doesn't do standard issue. Everything they carry is bespoke, custom-built, handcrafted, and almost offensively elegant. Umbrellas that are bulletproof and can fire tranquilizer darts, shoes with blades in the toe, signet rings that deliver enough electric current to drop a man in under a second, hats with razor-sharp brims that can take a man's head clean off if thrown correctly. Every single weapon looks like something you'd find in a Knightsbridge department store. That's the entire point. Kingsman agents walk through the most secure buildings on Earth, and nobody checks them twice, because they look like exactly what the establishment expects them to look like. Wealth. Why British unthreatening? It is, without question, the most brilliant cover in the history of espionage. So now you understand what Ethan Hunt is sitting across from when this briefing ends. Not a rogue nation, not a terrorist cell, not even a corrupt government agency he can expose through official channels. An organization with no official channels. A network with no digital trail. A group of extraordinarily trained, extraordinarily equipped operatives who have spent over a century perfecting the art of being invisible, and who, apparently, have a traitor in their ranks who just sold nuclear codes to someone that the entire combined intelligence apparatus of the Western world cannot identify. And IMF's total intelligence file on Kingsman. 14 pages. 11 of which are speculation. Ethan reads all 14 pages in about 20 minutes. Then he reads them again. Then he sits in silence for a long moment, which, if you know anything about Ethan Hunt, is genuinely alarming, because this is a man who is usually 3 steps ahead before most people have finished explaining the problem. But right now, he's not 3 steps ahead. He's not even 1 step ahead. He's standing at the door of something he cannot fully see, cannot fully measure, and cannot prepare for in any of the usual ways. And then, because this is Ethan Hunt, and this is what he does, he picks up the briefing device, listens to the last line one more time. This message will self-destruct in 5 seconds. He sets it down, walks to the window, and behind him, quietly, the device burns itself to ash. The mission parameters are almost insultingly sparse. Infiltrate Kingsman. Identify the traitor. Locate the arms dealer the codes were sold to. Neutralize the transaction before the codes are activated. Do it without Kingsman knowing IMF was ever there. Do it alone, because bringing a team into an environment this dark, and this unknown puts every member of that team at a level of risk that Ethan won't accept. And do it fast, because whoever bought those codes isn't waiting around for the world to catch up. Now, before we follow Ethan into what comes next, because what comes next is where this gets genuinely complicated, you need to understand one more thing about Kingsman that the briefing didn't cover. Because the briefing told Ethan what Kingsman is. It didn't tell him what Kingsman does to people who come looking uninvited. And that is a very different kind of education. One that Ethan Hunt is about to receive personally. Most people, when they're given an impossible task, start by figuring out what they need. More information, more resources, more time. Ethan Hunt does something different. He starts by figuring out what he's afraid of. Not because he's pessimistic, not because he doubts himself, But because in 20 years of doing the most dangerous work on the planet, he's learned one brutal truth about missions that go wrong. They don't go wrong because of what you knew and prepared for. They go wrong because of what you didn't think to be afraid of. So Ethan sits down with 14 pages, 11 of which are speculation, remember, and he starts looking for the thing that should terrify him most about Kingsman. And he finds it faster than he'd like. Here's what those 14 pages tell him, and here's what they don't. The pages tell him the basics, the tailor shop front, the round table naming structure, the funding model, old generational wealth, completely untraceable, never deposited in any bank that answers to a government regulator. The rough operational history, interventions in conflicts that officially resolved themselves, assassinations that were ruled natural causes, diplomatic crises that quietly disappeared before they became public. Kingsman has been active, by IMF's best estimate, for over 100 years. In 100 years, they have never once appeared in a leaked document. Never once had a former agent sell their story. Never once had an operation traced back to them after the fact. Not one time in a century. Think about what that means. Every intelligence agency on Earth, CIA, MI6, Mossad, FSB, has had leaks, has had defectors, has had scandals, has had moments where the curtain slipped and the world got a glimpse of something it wasn't supposed to see. Kingsman has had none of that. Zero. In 100 years. That's not luck. That's not good security protocols. That is a level of institutional loyalty that borders on something Ethan doesn't have a clinical word for. He writes one word in the margin of the file. Devotion. Now here's where it gets even more interesting, because the pages tell Ethan what Kingsman does, but they barely scratch the surface of what Kingsman is, meaning the culture, the psychology, the internal code that makes these people function the way they do. And that gap, that enormous, dangerous gap between operational facts and human understanding, is where Ethan's real problem live. Ease. See, Ethan Hunt has built his entire career on one foundational skill. Reading people. Not just their tells, not just their body language, not just the micro-expressions that flicker across someone's face for a quarter of a second before they lie to you. All of that, yes, absolutely, Ethan does all of that instinctively without thinking about it. But it goes deeper than that. Ethan reads systems of people. He walks into a room and within 60 seconds he understands the power structure. He knows who's insecure, who's overcompensating, who wants to be seen as the smartest person present, who's pretending to be less than they are, who's the real decision maker even if they're standing in the corner saying nothing. He reads all of that, and then he finds the crack, the one human vulnerability in the system that he can use to get where he needs to go. He has done this in Russian military facilities, in Vatican archives, in Moroccan black markets, in the private dining rooms of billionaires who believed they were completely untouchable. Every single time, he finds the crack. But here's what the 14 pages tell him about Kingsman agents, and here's why it stops him cold. Kingsman's selection process isn't designed to find the best candidates. It's designed to destroy them first. Every person who enters Kingsman's selection goes through a process that is specifically, deliberately, methodically engineered to strip away every psychological defense mechanism a human being carries. The sleep deprivation, the social isolation, the tests that have no correct answer, designed not to evaluate your solution, but to watch how you behave when you realize there is no solution. The moments of apparent kindness that are actually deeper tests of whether you'll let your guard down. The manufactured crises at 3 in the morning when your body and mind are at their lowest point and your truest instincts take over. By the time Kingsman trusts an agent with a mission, that agent has been psychologically taken apart and rebuilt. Every weakness identified, every trigger mapped, every emotional vulnerability either resolved or buried so deep it cannot be accessed by anyone from the outside. Kingsman agents are not just trained to be unreadable. They are constructed to be unreadable. There is a difference. A trained person can slip. Pressure, surprise, emotional shock, any of these can crack trained composure if applied correctly. Ethan knows this. He's done it dozens of times. But a constructed person, someone whose psychology has been rebuilt from the ground up specifically to resist exactly the kind of pressure Ethan applies. That's a different problem entirely. That's not a lock he can pick. That's a lock that was designed knowing someone like him would eventually try. And then there's the tech problem. Because Ethan is used to having the best gadgets in any room he walks into. IMF's technology division is, without exaggeration, decades ahead of anything commercially available and at least a generation ahead of most government intelligence agencies. He's used to being the most technologically equipped person in any given situation. Inside Kingsman, he won't be. Kingsman's technology is different from IMF's in a way that's difficult to explain unless you understand the philosophy behind it. IMF builds for adaptability, modular, mass-producible, deployable anywhere by anyone with sufficient training. It's brilliant engineering optimized for flexibility. Kingsman builds for perfection. Every single piece of Kingsman technology is handcrafted, custom-built for the individual agent who carries it, tested not in laboratories but in actual field conditions over months before it's ever trusted in a real operation. The umbrella that can withstand automatic weapon fire at close range. The shoes with the blade mechanism in the toe cap. A blade that deploys with exactly the right amount of pressure so it becomes instinctive, not calculated. The signet ring that delivers a precisely calibrated electric charge. Enough to incapacitate, never enough to kill unless the agent decides otherwise. Every weapon looks like an accessory. Every accessory is a weapon. And the most alarming part, the part that makes Ethan set down the file and stare at the ceiling for a long moment, is this. IMF knows about approximately 40% of Kingsman's gadget catalog, which means 60% of what those agents are carrying on any given day is completely unknown. He won't know what hit him, possibly literally, until it already has. Ethan spends 4 hours with those 14 pages. He reads them until he has them memorized, until the speculation in 11 of them feels as familiar as fact, until he can close his eyes and map what little he knows about Kingsman's structure the way he maps a building, entry points, power centers, blind spots. And when he's done, he has one conclusion. There is no way into Kingsman from the outside. You can not hack your way in. There's nothing to hack. You cannot buy your way in. Their loyalty isn't transactional. You cannot threaten your way in. People who have been psychologically rebuilt don't respond to threat the way ordinary people do. The only way into Kingsman is to be chosen by Kingsman. And the moment that thought finishes forming, the moment Ethan sees the one door that's actually open, his phone buzzes with a message from his analyst back at IMF. 3 words. We found something. The something they found has a name. Captain James Holloway, British Army, Special Air Service, which, if you need a reference point, is the British equivalent of Delta Force, possibly the most elite ground combat unit on Earth, the kind of soldiers who make other special forces operators nervous. Holloway served 12 years, decorated, brilliant tactical mind, psychologically evaluated as exceptional under pressure, no family, no close relationships outside the regiment, no financial obligations, no digital footprint beyond his military record. On paper, James Holloway is the perfect Kingsman candidate, which is exactly why Kingsman recruited him 6 weeks ago. And exactly why, 3 weeks later, James Holloway turned up dead in a river outside Edinburgh, ruled an accident, case closed, nothing to see here. Except IMF's analyst pulled the autopsy, and the manner of death has a very specific signature. The same signature attached to 4 other deaths in the past 8 months, all connected, by degrees of separation that take serious analytical work to trace, to the ghost arms dealer who bought the nuclear codes. James Holloway didn't drown accidentally. He was removed because someone needed his Kingsman candidate spot to stay empty, because someone needed a window. And now Ethan Hunt is going to climb through it. The cover is elegant in the way that only truly desperate plans can be elegant. Ethan assumes Holloway's identity completely. Military record, backstory, mannerisms, psychological profile, all of it studied, absorbed, and performed. IMF's forgery division builds him a past so detailed it could survive scrutiny from MI6, service medals with actual wear on them, a regimental tattoo in exactly the right place, medical records showing the specific injuries a man in Holloway's unit would have accumulated over 12 years of active service. On paper and in person, Ethan Hunt ceases to exist. For the next however long this takes, he is James Holloway, disgraced, discharged under circumstances that are just ambiguous enough to be interesting. No family to check his story with, no friends close enough to know his face. The perfect ghost. The perfect candidate. There's just one problem. And it's not the kind of problem that IMF's forgery division can solve. James Holloway is British. Specifically, and this matters enormously, James Holloway is upper-middle-class British. The kind of British that has opinions about which county produces the best wool. The kind of British that knows instinctively which fork to use at a formal dinner without looking at anyone else first. The kind of British that can walk into a room full of old money aristocrats and make them feel, somehow, that they should be making a better impression. Ethan Hunt is from Bellevue, Nebraska. The gap between those two things is not a gap you bridge with a fake accent coach and a new passport. It is a civilizational chasm that took centuries of very specific cultural conditioning to create. And Ethan, brilliant, adaptable, multilingual, extraordinarily perceptive Ethan, has 48 hours to cross it. 48 hours. His IMF handler, Luther, who has been with Ethan through the truly insane missions, the ones that make this one look manageable, listens to the full briefing and then is quiet for a moment. Then he says very carefully, "You can learn any language in 72 hours. You speak Mandarin, Russian, Arabic, and Portuguese. But Ethan, British is not a language. It's a personality disorder that takes generations to develop." Ethan tells him they don't have 72 hours. They have 48. Luther does not look reassured. So here is what 48 hours looks like when Ethan Hunt decides to become someone else. Hour 1 through 6, the accent, not just the sounds, the rhythm, the specific music of upper-middle-class British English, which is flatter and drier and more internally amused than it sounds from the outside. The way certain words get swallowed rather than fully pronounced. The way questions are framed as statements and disagreements are framed as polite observations. The way everything is slightly underplayed. Because in this particular cultural register, enthusiasm is slightly embarrassing and composure is everything. Hour 7 through 14 deportment. Posture. The way Holloway would enter a room. Not the aggressive, shoulders forward, ready for anything physicality that 12 years of special forces instills. That part Ethan can do naturally. The other layer on top of it. The deliberate ease. The way the most dangerous men in Holloway's world carry themselves as though danger is a minor inconvenience they've already accounted for and frankly found a bit tedious. Hour 15 through 24 culture. And this is where it gets genuinely difficult. Because culture isn't facts. You can memorize facts. Ethan memorizes facts the way other people breathe, effortlessly, completely, permanently. He can learn the wine regions of Burgundy in an afternoon. He can learn the history of Savile Row tailoring in an evening. He can learn the correct form of address for every rank of British military officer before breakfast. But culture is instinct. It's the thing you reach for automatically, without thinking, because it was installed in you so early and so completely that it doesn't feel like knowledge, it feels like self. And Ethan doesn't have a lifetime of installation. He has 24 hours left. It's somewhere around hour 36. Ethan's sitting across from an IMF cultural consultant, who is a former Cambridge professor, and is currently looking at him the way a sculptor looks at marble that isn't quite cooperating, that something interesting happens. Ethan stops performing. Not because he gives up. Ethan Hunt does not give up, ever. But because he realizes, in the way he realizes things, suddenly and completely, that performing Holloway perfectly isn't actually the point. Kingsman's selection process is designed to strip away performance. That's the whole mechanism. They are not looking for the best actor. They are looking for what's underneath the actor, the real thing, the part that holds when everything else is taken away. So if Ethan performs Holloway perfectly, if he constructs a flawless imitation of a man, Kingsman will strip that performance away. And underneath it, they'll find Ethan Hunt. Which means the cover can't be a performance. It has to be a merger. He can't pretend to be James Holloway. He has to find every part of himself that is James Holloway, the military discipline, the comfort with danger, the psychological resilience, the quiet certainty of a man who has operated at the edge of human capability for a decade and survived, and let those parts come forward. And everything that is purely, recognizably, irreducibly Ethan Hunt needs to go somewhere Kingsman can't reach. He looks at the Cambridge professor across the table. "I think I've got it," he says. In a home county's accent that is, for the first time, genuinely convincing. The professor raises an eyebrow. Nods once. "Almost," he says. "The almost is what will keep you alive." Coming up, Ethan Hunt walks through the door of the most dangerous tailor shop on earth. And inside, someone is already waiting to see if he breaks. There's a specific feeling you get when you walk into a place that is completely, deliberately out of your league. Not intimidation exactly. Something more precise than that. It's the feeling of every invisible social rule in the room pressing against you simultaneously, every unspoken expectation, every standard of comportment that everyone else present absorbed in childhood, and you are only now, as an adult, becoming aware that you missed entirely. Most people in that situation shrink. Ethan Hunt walks through the door of the Kingsman tailor shop on Savile Row and feels every single one of those invisible pressures, and files them, catalogs them, turns them from obstacles into information. Because that's what Ethan does with discomfort. He reads it. The shop itself is exactly what it promises to be, which is somehow more disorienting than if it had been a cover. The wood paneling is genuine, 200 years old at minimum. The fabrics folded on the shelves have a quality that you can identify from across the room without touching them. The staff move with the particular unhurried efficiency of people who have never once in their professional lives needed to rush, because the people they serve always wait. Ethan is greeted by a man whose name he isn't given, shown to a room whose purpose he isn't told, left with 11 other people whose backgrounds he spends approximately 4 minutes mentally reconstructing from posture, eye movement, the specific way each of them is managing their own discomfort. 11 Kingsman candidates. And within those 4 minutes, Ethan has already identified something the room isn't supposed to tell him. One of these people is not a candidate. It's subtle, almost perfectly subtle, which is precisely why it registers. Every other person in that room is performing some version of composure, some doing it better than others, some barely holding it together, but all of them engaged in the genuine psychological work of managing a high-stakes, deeply uncertain situation. This one person isn't performing composure. They're performing composure. There's a layer, a C, unstructured quality to their stillness that's just slightly too considered. Their eyes move on a pattern that's almost natural, but almost is the operative word. They're scanning the room the same way Ethan is scanning the room, but they haven't noticed Ethan noticing, which means their training is excellent but not quite at the level that makes them invisible to someone operating at Ethan's frequency. Ethan doesn't react, doesn't look twice, doesn't change his breathing. He just adds it to the file he's building in his head and keeps moving. Someone sent a plant into this selection process. The question, which he tucks away for later, is whether the plant is working for the arms dealer, for Arthur, or for someone else entirely whose presence he hasn't accounted for yet. 3 possibilities, all of them dangerous, none of them something he can act on right now. Right now, the selection begins. The first test arrives without announcement, which is itself part of the test. The 12 candidates are shown to what appears to be a dormitory, 12 bunks, 1 bathroom, windows that look out onto a gray London morning. Standard enough. The kind of room that tells you nothing except that comfort is not a priority here. They're given 20 minutes to settle in. At the 18-minute mark, water begins coming through the floor. Not dramatically. Not with any alarm or warning or indication that this is intentional rather than a catastrophic plumbing failure. Just water, rising slowly, ankle height within 90 seconds, knee height within 3 minutes. The room's reaction is immediate and completely human. 3 candidates go straight to the door, locked, obviously. 2 start looking at the ceiling, trying to identify a structural weakness they could potentially exploit. 1 sits down on a bunk that is rapidly becoming submerged and appears to be running some kind of internal calculation. 2 are openly panicking. 3 are doing a reasonable impression of not panicking while clearly panicking. And Ethan. Ethan looks at the room for approximately 4 seconds. Then he walks to the bathroom. Here's what those 4 seconds told him. The water is coming through the floor at a consistent rate from multiple points simultaneously, which rules out accidental pipe failure because pipes fail at single points, not evenly distributed ones. The rate of inflow is controlled, meaning there's a valve somewhere being managed by someone watching. The room has no visible drain, but every room that fills with water has to have an exit for that water, because otherwise you'd have to drain the entire building to reset the test. And the bathroom, slightly elevated, single entrance, is the only part of the room with a raised floor panel that could conceal infrastructure. Ethan lifts the panel in the bathroom floor. Drain access, and alongside the drain, an emergency pressure release that would stop the inflow entirely. He presses it. The water stops rising. Total elapsed time, 90 seconds. The room goes very quiet. 10 candidates staring at Ethan. Water at knee height, still and calm now. The crisis over before most of them had finished processing that it was happening. And from somewhere above, through a speaker so discreet it's essentially invisible, a voice. Not congratulatory, not warm, measured in the specific way that people are measured when they are thinking very carefully about what they're seeing. Candidate Holloway, step out please. The voice belongs to Arthur. And the way he says please makes it clear that it is not a request. Arthur doesn't ask how Ethan solved it. He already knows how Ethan solved it. He was watching. What he wants to know is something the solution itself didn't tell him. Most candidates, Arthur says, take between 8 and 14 minutes. The record before today was 4 minutes 20 seconds, set by our current Galahad incidentally. Ethan says nothing, waits. You took 90 seconds. Still nothing from Ethan. That's either exceptional instinct, Arthur says, or prior knowledge of the test. And there it is, the first real pressure, applied cleanly, without aggression, in the way that only someone who has been doing this for a very long time knows how to apply it. Ethan meets his eyes, holds them for exactly the right amount of time. I noticed the floor panel, he says. I don't like waiting for problems to get worse. Arthur looks at him for a long moment. No, he says finally, I don't imagine you do. He lets Ethan go, but the way he watches him leave tells Ethan everything he needs to know. Arthur is not convinced. Arthur is not suspicious. Arthur is something more precise and more dangerous than either of those things. Arthur is interested. And in Kingsman's selection process, being interesting to Arthur is not the same thing as being safe. The parachute test comes on day 2, and if the flooding room was a test of observation and problem-solving, the parachute test is something else entirely. It's a test of who you are when the mathematics of survival don't add up in your favor. 12 candidates, 1 aircraft, cruising altitude of 4,000 feet, and when the cargo door opens and the jumpmaster steps aside, 12 deployment bags hanging on the rack, and one of them noticeably, undeniably lighter than the rest. 11 parachutes, 12 people. The candidates look at each other. And this is where it gets fascinating, because the test isn't really about the parachute. It's about what each candidate reveals in the 30 seconds between realizing the problem and acting on it. Some reach for a bag immediately, instinct, self-preservation, completely human and completely disqualifying in Kingsman's framework. 2 start negotiating, trying to build consensus, establish who has the weakest claim to survival based on skill set or mission value, which is tactically coherent but reveals a certain kind of cold calculation that Kingsman finds interesting but not sufficient. 1 candidate, the plant, Ethan notes, reaches for a bag with just slightly too much hesitation before taking it, like someone performing the moral conflict of the moment rather than experiencing it. And Ethan picks up one of the full bags, hands it to the candidate standing nearest to him, a young woman, former military, genuine terror behind extremely controlled eyes. Then he walks to the aircraft wall and starts examining the emergency equipment locker. Emergency equipment lockers on military jump aircraft contain, among other things, a reserve deployment system designed for equipment drops rather than personnel, not rated for human use under normal protocols, absolutely functional under abnormal ones if you know what you're adjusting and why. Ethan knows. He's out of the aircraft 30 seconds after everyone else, on a modified equipment chute that deposits him 300 meters from the landing zone, and he hits the ground rolling in a way that distributes impact across his whole body rather than concentrating it anywhere structural. He's on his feet before the last candidate has finished gathering their canopy. Above him, he can feel Arthur watching. Not with suspicion now, with something that takes Arthur considerably longer to identify, because it's an emotion he doesn't experience frequently in this context. Concern. Because here's the problem that Ethan hasn't fully reckoned with yet, and it's a problem that Arthur has already seen clearly. In Kingsman's selection history, the candidates who solve everything fastest, who find every third option, who turn every impossible situation into a demonstration of lateral thinking and physical capability, those candidates don't always make the best Kingsman agents. Sometimes they make the most dangerous loose variables. Ethan Hunt, operating as James Holloway, is brilliant in a way that Kingsman's framework cannot fully contain. And things that Kingsman's framework cannot contain have a history of becoming problems. The summons comes at 11 o'clock that night. No knock, just a note slipped under the door, a single card, Kingsman watermark, 4 words in precise handwriting. My office now, M. Merlin's office is not what you'd expect from a man whose job title is essentially Kingsman's head of technology and training. There are no screens covering every wall, no holographic displays, no evidence of the extraordinary technical infrastructure that Ethan knows is operating somewhere beneath this building. There's a desk, bookshelves floor to ceiling, a single lamp, and Merlin sitting behind the desk with the particular stillness of a man who has made peace with patience in a way that most people never manage. He's been watching Ethan since day one. Every candidate gets Merlin's attention, but the quality of attention he's giving Ethan is different, more calibrated, like a watchmaker looking at a mechanism he hasn't encountered before, not suspicious, not admiring, but genuinely, professionally curious. Sit down, Holloway, he says. I want to show you something. What Merlin wants to show him is not in the office. It's 2 floors down, through a door that requires 3 separate authentication steps to open, in a room that smells of machine oil and leather, and something that Ethan identifies after a moment as gunpowder. Very old, very refined, integrated into the fabric of the space over decades. The vault. And Ethan Hunt, a man who has held his composure in rooms containing active nuclear devices, in rooms where every person present was trying to kill him, in rooms where the fate of millions of people rested entirely on his ability to appear unconcerned. Ethan Hunt walks into this vault and feels something he doesn't feel often. Genuine, uncomplicated awe. Merlin walks him through it methodically. The umbrella first, which looks from 3 feet away like an exceptionally well-made umbrella, which it is. It is also bulletproof, rated to withstand automatic weapon fire at close range, contains a directional stun discharge in the handle, and has a dart mechanism in the tip that can deliver any of 6 different compounds, depending on which combination of pressure points on the grip you activate. The hat, razor-brimmed, perfectly balanced for throwing, weighted in a way that makes it aerodynamically precise at distances up to 30 meters. The cufflinks, which are not explosive in the conventional sense, but contain a microcharge capable of producing a directed concussive burst that will take a door off its hinges or temporarily blind and disorient everyone within a 4-meter radius. The shoe's blade in the right toe cap, activated by a specific striking motion that would never occur during normal walking, but is completely instinctive in a close-quarters combat scenario once your body has been trained to it. And dozens more, each one more elegant than the last, each one so integrated into the appearance of ordinary luxury that carrying them is genuinely indistinguishable from being a well-dressed British gentleman on his way to lunch. Ethan turns each item over in his hands, examines the mechanisms, asks precise, specific questions that Merlin answers with visible appreciation, because most candidates ask what does it do, and Ethan is asking how does it do it, and the difference between those questions tells Merlin a great deal. While doing all of this, while genuinely, honestly admiring the craftsmanship with a part of his brain that has always responded to excellence regardless of its source, another part of Ethan's brain is doing something else entirely. Cataloging every weakness. The umbrella's discharge has a 2-second reset window. The hat requires a minimum backswing that telegraphs the throw by approximately half a second to a trained observer. The cufflink's concussive burst is non-directional despite the marketing. If you're within 4 meters, you go down 2. He files all of it, quietly, behind eyes that are showing Merlin exactly the right amount of impressed. It's when they're leaving the vault that Merlin says the thing that Ethan isn't prepared for. Not because it's threatening, not because it's suspicious. Because it's honest in a way that very few people in Ethan's life have ever been honest with him. You know what IMF gives its best operatives, Merlin says. Not a real question, a setup. Deniability, which is a sophisticated way of saying if this goes wrong, we never knew you. Ethan says nothing. Kingsman gives its agents something different, Merlin continues. A name, a seat, a place in something that was here before you and will be here after you. When you become Galahad, you don't just take a code name. You take on every Galahad who came before, their record, their reputation, their legacy. He looks at Ethan with the directness of a man who has had this conversation many times and means it every single time. You belong to something, and it belongs to you. That's not nothing, Holloway. For men like us, that's very nearly everything. And here's the thing. Here's the thing that makes this moment the most quietly dangerous moment in Ethan's mission so far, more dangerous than the flooding room. More dangerous than Arthur's scrutiny, more dangerous than the plant he's identified and hasn't yet figured out. Ethan Hunt, the man who has faked his own death, burned his cover, walked away from every stable thing in his life so many times it has become the defining rhythm of his existence. Ethan Hunt hears what Merlin is saying. And he doesn't just understand it intellectually. He feels it. Because Merlin isn't wrong. IMF gives Ethan missions. Kingsman gives its agents meaning. And standing in this vault, in this building that is 100 years old and still standing and still fighting, Ethan catches himself, just for a moment, imagining what it would mean to actually belong here. To be Galahad. To carry something forward instead of always burning it down to save it. He almost means it when he hears himself say, quietly, in Holloway's voice, but with something underneath it that is entirely his own. I think I could belong here. Merlin looks at him for a long moment. I think you might, he says, which is precisely why I'm watching you so carefully. And that right there is the most dangerous thing anyone has said to Ethan Hunt since this mission began. Not a threat, not a warning, a truth. And truths in Ethan's world are always more dangerous than threats. There's a kind of warfare that doesn't involve weapons, doesn't involve raised voices, doesn't involve any of the physical vocabulary of conflict that Ethan Hunt has spent 20 years mastering. No threat is made explicitly. No line is crossed visibly. No single moment you could point to afterward and say, there, that's where it happened. It's the warfare of rooms, of tables, of who sits where and who speaks first, and who laughs at whose joke, and who gets looked at when something important is said. The British aristocracy has been fighting this war for centuries. They are, without question, the best in the world at it. And Ethan Hunt, who has infiltrated Russian military installations, who has talked his way past CIA black site security, who has negotiated with arms dealers in 4 languages simultaneously. Ethan Hunt walks into the Kingsman dining room on the 3rd evening of selection and feels the battle lines form around him before he's taken 3 steps through the door. It starts with the wine, which, honestly, is exactly where you'd expect it to start. The candidates are seated for a formal dinner, 12 people around a table that has probably hosted actual monarchs at some point, under lighting that costs more than most people's monthly rent, with a wine selection that a sommelier would need a moment to compose himself before discussing. The bottle that arrives at Ethan's end of the table is presented by a candidate named Rupert, 3rd generation Eton, jaw like a geographic feature, the specific brand of effortless confidence that comes from never once having had to question whether you belong in any room you've ever entered. Rupert pours, sets the bottle down so the label faces Ethan, watches him with the patient, pleasant expression of a man setting a trap he's absolutely certain will work. The label is a 2009 Domaine de la Romane Conti, which is, for reference, one of the most expensive and most discussed wines produced anywhere on Earth. The kind of wine that has its own Wikipedia page and its own devoted academic literature, and its own community of obsessives who will argue about specific vintages with the intensity most people reserve for geopolitical crises. Rupert is waiting for Ethan to either identify it correctly, which would be impressive, or hesitate, which would be revealing. Ethan lifts the glass, holds it to the light for exactly the right amount of time, swirls it once, takes a single, considered sip, sets it down. 2009, he says, though I'd have held this one another 3 years personally. The tannins aren't quite where they should be for a bottle at this price. He says it pleasantly, not showily, the way a man says something obvious that doesn't require emphasis. Rupert's expression doesn't change, but something behind his eyes recalibrates. And here's the thing, Ethan isn't bluffing the knowledge. He actually knows this wine. He knows it because 4 years ago he ran a cover in Monaco for 11 days as a private equity consultant with specific expertise in rare wine investment. And 11 days of living a cover means 11 days of knowing it completely. And Ethan's memory doesn't have a delete function. Monaco gave him the wine knowledge. It also gave him the particular social fluency of European old money, the cadence, the references, the specific texture of a conversation among people who have never had to think about money because money has never been something they've had to think about. He's been in this room before. Different building, different country, same war. The difference is, in Monaco, he was playing offense. Tonight he's playing defense, which is a different game entirely, and significantly more exhausting. The dinner etiquette is where it gets complicated. Not because Ethan doesn't know the rules. He does, completely. He spent 4 hours of his 48-hour preparation window on exactly this. 7 courses, 5 forks, 3 knives, 2 glasses already on the table and 2 more arriving with subsequent courses. The system is logical once you understand its logic. Work from outside in. Never the fish knife for the meat course. Never the dessert spoon until it's placed by the server, regardless of when you think dessert is arriving. He knows all of it. The problem is the gap between knowing and inhabiting. Someone who has grown up with this knowledge doesn't think about it. They reach for the correct fork the way they reach for a light switch in their own home, automatically, without directing attention to the action, while their conscious mind is entirely occupied with the conversation they're having. Ethan has to think about it. And thinking about it means that on the 3rd course, a dish that arrives with a fork he hasn't used yet, in a slightly ambiguous position given the way the setting was laid, he pauses. 1 beat. Half a second maybe. Before his eyes find the correct implement, and his hand moves with complete assurance. Half a second. Nobody at the table shows any reaction. Except one. Her cover name anyway, is Charlotte, seated 4 places to Ethan's left. Former intelligence background, Ethan clocked that on day 1, the way she processes a room is professional, not instinctive, which means trained rather than born into it. She's good, genuinely good, but she's also been watching Ethan since the flooding room with the specific attention of someone who has found an anomaly they haven't categorized yet. She sees the half-second pause. She doesn't react visibly, doesn't look at him afterward, doesn't say anything. She simply files it. The same way Ethan filed the plant on day 1. Which means Ethan now has 2 problems at this dinner table. Rupert, who is performing a class war openly and can therefore be managed openly, and Charlotte, who is doing something much quieter and much more precise and cannot be managed at all until he understands what she actually is. He adds her to the file in his head and keeps eating. The conversation that changes things happens at 11:45 that night. Not at the dinner table. Not in any room that feels observed, and by this point in Kingsman's selection, Ethan assumes every room is observed, which means his behavior in all of them is performance, which means he hasn't had a single unmanaged moment in 3 days. It's in the corridor outside the candidate's dormitory, a narrow, poorly lit stretch of Victorian stone that the building's heating system hasn't fully reached. And sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, shoes off, jacket off, looking for the first time like a person rather than a candidate, is the one person in this building who Ethan hasn't been able to fully categorize. The Eggsy of this story. His name in this selection is Danny, and Danny is everything the other candidates are not. He didn't come through Eton or Harrow or any of the feeder schools that pipeline into Kingsman's aristocratic orbit. He came through a council estate in South London, a youth offending record that he sealed at 17, and a military service record that is, by any objective measure, more impressive than anyone else in the selection, including Ethan. He was nominated by a Kingsman agent who saw something in him that the selection panel's first instinct said wasn't there. He has spent 3 days in this building being made to feel, in the particular weaponized way that British class operates, that the nomination was a mistake. He's still here. He's still fighting. And sitting in the corridor at 11:45 with his socks on the cold stone floor, he looks up at Ethan, at Holloway, with the expression of someone who has decided that pretending everything is fine takes more energy than he has left tonight. "You're not one of them either," he says, not accusatory, just certain. And here's where it becomes genuinely difficult for Ethan Hunt. Because Danny is right. And Danny is saying it in the way that people say true things when they're tired, without architecture, without strategy, without any of the protective layering that calculated conversation involves. Just the true thing, offered plainly, in the hope that someone else will confirm they're not alone in it. Ethan could deflect. He has 17 ways to deflect a conversation like this without the other person realizing they've been deflected. It's a skill set he has refined over 20 years and thousands of interactions. He doesn't use any of them. No, he says, I'm not. And that's enough. That single honest syllable, the first genuinely honest thing Ethan has said since he walked through the door of that tailor shop, opens a conversation that lasts 40 minutes and covers, among other things, the specific social mechanics of how Kingsman's existing culture makes outsiders feel the illegitimacy of their presence without ever saying it directly. The question of whether fitting in is something you learn or something you perform, and whether there's a meaningful difference. And Danny's theory, delivered with the particular clarity of someone who has thought about something very carefully in the absence of anyone to discuss it with. That Kingsman's selection process was originally designed to find people exactly like him, and has since been colonized by people who wanted to find people exactly like them instead. It's a genuinely brilliant observation. Ethan tells him so, means it completely, and watches Danny's face do the thing that people's faces do when they've been waiting to be seen correctly, and someone finally sees them. This opening, this release of something held carefully for too long. And Ethan, who cannot be Danny's friend, who cannot let this connection develop beyond a point that risks his cover, who needs to remain, fundamentally, a version of himself that Danny cannot fully access. Ethan feels the specific weight of that limitation more acutely than he's felt anything in the 3 days since he walked through that door. Because Danny is honest. In a building full of people who are performing, calculating, testing, and maneuvering, Danny is simply, stubbornly, exhaustingly honest. And honesty, in Ethan's world, is so rare it feels almost archaeological. Get some sleep, Ethan says eventually, standing, keeping his voice in Holloway's register even though part of him is tired of Holloway's register. Danny nods, looks up at him. You're going to win this thing, you know, he says, whatever you're actually here for. Ethan goes very still. What makes you say that? Danny shrugs, pulls his jacket back on. Because you're the only one in there who isn't trying to win it. He goes inside. Ethan stands in the corridor for a long moment. Then adds Danny, the real Danny, not the candidate, to the list of things in this building he needs to protect. The message arrives at 3:17 a.m. Not through any channel that Kingsman could intercept. Ethan's IMF communication line is embedded in a modified watch that piggybacks on civilian satellite frequencies in a way that looks, to any signal analysis system, like ambient electronic noise. Luther built it specifically for operations where standard secure channels would be a liability. 3 words on the display, decoded automatically. Timeline moved up. Then 36 hours, call. Ethan is in the building's one blind spot, a maintenance corridor he identified on day 1 during a fire drill that he is now entirely certain was not a fire drill, within 4 minutes of receiving the message. Luther's voice is quiet and precise in his earpiece, the way Luther gets quiet and precise when the news is bad enough that volume would feel inappropriate. The codes are moving, Luther says. Transfer is scheduled for 36 hours from now. New location, we don't have it yet. The buyer has accelerated the timeline. Our analyst thinks someone tipped them that there's movement on the investigation. Ethan processes that. Someone tipped them. Inside IMF, he asks. Inside somewhere, Luther says. Ethan, you need to make a decision. Come out now and we take whatever we have to a joint task force. Or I go deeper, Ethan says. Silence on the line. There's a third option, Luther says carefully. There's usually a third option with you. The intelligence archive, Ethan says. Kingsman has to have a file on the arms dealer, an organization that's been running covert operations for 100 years and has no record of this transaction. That's not a gap in their intelligence. That's a choice. I need to know why they made it. More silence. Ethan, Luther says, if they catch you in their archive, then the cover is blown and we're in a different kind of problem, Ethan says. I know, give me tonight. Luther is quiet for a moment that contains, Ethan knows, about 14 different objections that Luther has already calculated he won't be able to make stick. Tonight, Luther says, that's all. Getting into Kingsman's intelligence archive requires bypassing 4 security layers. The first is physical, a door that requires a biometric scan and a key card simultaneously, both of which need to match an authorized profile in the system. Ethan lifts the key card from Merlin's office during a moment when Merlin steps away to take a call. The biometric scan he solves with a silicone overlay, a technique he's used twice before, never in conditions this controlled. The second layer is motion detection inside the corridor leading to the archive. He maps the sensor field during his first 3 minutes in the corridor. Every sensor has a pattern, every pattern has a gap, and moves through it in 4 minutes 40 seconds. The third layer is an alert system triggered by the archive door itself, if opened without a simultaneous system-level authorization code entered at a terminal 30 meters away, which should be impossible for a single person to manage. Ethan has spent 3 days memorizing the layout of this building. He's not working alone tonight, not physically, but through the watch. Luther, patched into a signal Ethan is relaying through the building's own maintenance network, enters the authorization code from the IMF terminal while Ethan opens the door. 30 meters of impossible distance, solved by the fact that Ethan never actually works alone. The fourth layer is the archive itself, physical files, not digital, no network to hack, no remote access, the oldest and most effective security system in the intelligence world. You have to be in the room. Ethan is in the room. He has 40 minutes before the next guard rotation. He works through the filing system, organized by operational theater, then by date, then by asset classification, with the focused efficiency of someone who has done archival intelligence work in conditions considerably less comfortable than this. The arms dealer's name, when he finds it, is in a file dated 8 months ago. The file is thick, comprehensive, the kind of documentation that takes months of careful intelligence gathering to assemble, surveillance photographs, financial transaction records, network mapping, the arms dealer's connections, supply chain, buyer relationships, all of it traced with the meticulous precision that Kingsman brings to everything. Kingsman has known about this arms dealer for 8 months. 8 months. While the CIA was blind, while IMF had nothing, while every Western intelligence agency was operating on fragments and speculation, Kingsman had the full picture. Ethan turns to the action log at the back of the file. Every intelligence file of this kind has an action log, the record. D of what was done, with the information gathered. He reads it, then reads it again. The action log contains one entry. File reviewed by Arthur. No operational action authorized. Asset relationship to be preserved. Reviewed 14 March. Asset relationship to be preserved. Ethan stands very still in the middle of Kingsman's intelligence archive at 4 in the morning and lets that sentence complete its full meaning inside him. The arms dealer isn't just known to Kingsman. The arms dealer is connected to Kingsman, specifically to Arthur, connected in a way that Arthur classified as an asset relationship, meaning this isn't ignorance, isn't oversight, isn't a gap in their intelligence network. Arthur knew. Arthur reviewed the file. Arthur looked at the evidence of an arms deal involving nuclear codes and made a deliberate, documented decision to do nothing. Because the buyer, whoever bought those codes, is someone Arthur wants to protect. Ethan photographs every page of the file, every surveillance photo, every transaction record, every line of the network map, all of it transmitted through the watch to Luther in compressed bursts that take 11 seconds per photograph. Then he replaces the file exactly as he found it, closes the archive, re-engages every security layer on his way out, and is back in his bunk by 4:47 a.m. He doesn't sleep. He lies in the dark with the silence of the building around him and reconfigures everything. Every interaction, every observation, every data point from the past 3 days, through the filter of what he now knows. Arthur isn't just Kingsman's leader. Arthur is the corruption at the center of the mission. And Ethan has spent 3 days letting Arthur watch him. Which means Arthur has spent 3 days deciding what to do about him. The mission didn't just become more complicated tonight. It became something else entirely. It became a betrayal story. And in Ethan Hunt's experience, in 20 years of missions that went sideways in every direction imaginable, betrayal stories only end one of 2 ways. Someone exposes the truth, or someone buries it along with the person who found it. The question isn't whether Arthur knows Ethan is getting close. The question is, how long has he known, and what has he already set in motion? There's a pattern to Ethan Hunt's missions. Not in the details are always different, always specific, always shaped by whatever particular version of catastrophe he's been handed this time. But underneath the details, in the structural bones of how these things unfold, there is a pattern so consistent that if you've watched enough of his history, you start to feel it coming before it arrives. It goes like this. Ethan is given a mission with a clear enemy. He pursues that enemy with everything he has. And then, somewhere in the middle, when he's already committed, already exposed, already past the point where walking away is a clean option, he discovers that the real enemy isn't the one he was sent after. The real enemy is the person who sent him. The man at the top, the trusted authority, the institutional figure whose job is to be above suspicion, which turns out to be the most effective cover of all. It happened with IMF's own director, with the secretary, with the head of the CIA's Special Activities Division, with men whose names were on the buildings and whose portraits were on the walls and whose compromise, when it finally surfaced, felt like the ground shifting under everything that had been built on top of them. Every single time, Ethan finds the rot at the center. And every single time, he does the same thing. He walks straight toward it. He spends the hours between 4:47 a.m. and 7 a.m., the point when the building begins to wake, when footsteps start appearing in corridors, and the smell of breakfast drifts up from the kitchen. in a state that looks, from the outside, like stillness. It isn't stillness. It's the particular internal velocity of a man working through a problem that has no clean solution, eliminating options one by one until he's left with the one that remains. Option 1. Extract. Take the archive photographs to Luther, hand the evidence to a joint task force, let the machinery of official intelligence work grind through it. Clean. Safe. Almost certainly too slow, the codes transfer in 36 hours. Task forces take longer than that to mobilize. And Arthur will see movement the moment IMF files anything through official channels, because a man who has spent decades managing institutional corruption knows how to read the warning signs. Option 2. Go around Arthur. Find another Kingsman senior agent, Merlin, potentially, present the evidence, let Kingsman police itself. Possible. Except Ethan has been in this building for 3 days and still cannot determine with certainty whose loyalty belongs to whom. Merlin feels clean, feels genuinely devoted to something larger than Arthur, but feels isn't evidence and handing classified IMF intelligence to an unverified asset is the kind of decision that gets people killed. Option 3. Ethan lies on his bunk and stares at the ceiling and knows, with the bone-deep certainty of a man who has done this enough times to recognize his own inevitable decisions, that there is no version of this where he doesn't walk through Arthur's door and put everything on the table. Not because it's tactically optimal, because it's the only move that creates a situation Ethan can actually control. And because in 20 years of finding corruption at the center of things, Ethan has learned that the only way to deal with it cleanly is to look it directly in the eye and give it the chance to make a choice. Sometimes they choose correctly. Not often, but sometimes. He requests a meeting with Arthur at 9 in the morning. Private, framed as a candidate concern about the selection process. The kind of meeting Arthur has undoubtedly had dozens of times and which carries no flag, no alarm, nothing that would suggest anything other than a nervous candidate seeking reassurance. Arthur's office is on the top floor, occupies a corner of the building that gets morning light from 2 directions, warm, golden, the specific quality of London light on the rare days it decides to be generous. The room is lined with photographs of previous Kingsman agents, generation after generation of men and women who carried the round table names and the responsibility that came with them. Ethan takes all of this in during the 3 seconds between the door opening and Arthur rising from behind his desk. Then he sits down, places a single folded paper on the desk between them, and looks at Arthur with the expression he reserves for these moments, calm, direct, entirely without aggression and completely immovable. "I was in your archive last night," he says. Arthur's face does nothing, which is itself a response. A man genuinely surprised shows something, even briefly. Arthur shows nothing, which means he isn't surprised, which means he already knew, which means the situation is already further along than Ethan had calculated. He adjusts, keeps his voice level. "The arms dealer your organization has been protecting for 8 months, Ethan continues. "I know who the buyer is. I know the codes transfer in 36 hours. And I know that the file in your archive has your signature on the decision to do nothing." He unfolds the paper. It's a single page, a condensed summary of the archive's key evidence, the transaction record, the network map, the action log entry. Enough to be damning, specific enough to prove he's seen the full file. "You have one option that ends this cleanly," Ethan says. "Stand down. Give me everything you have on the transfer location. Let me finish what I came here to do. And whatever arrangement you have with the buyer, whatever you believed you were protecting, I will do everything in my power to ensure that Kingsman's institutional integrity survives what comes after. He means it, completely. It isn't a negotiating position. It's a genuine offer made in good faith to a man Ethan genuinely wishes had made different choices. Arthur looks at the paper for a long moment. Then he looks at Ethan and smiles. Not warmly, not with the manufactured warmth of a politician or the cold amusement of a villain who has been waiting for this scene. Something more complicated than either of those. The smile of a man who has thought about this moment, who has perhaps been thinking about it for the 3 days since Ethan walked through his door and solved the flooding room in 90 seconds, and has already decided what it requires of him. "You're not James Holloway," Arthur says. A statement, not a question, settled and certain. "No," Ethan says, "I'm not." "American," Arthur says. "IMF, I'd imagine. You have their particular flavor of reckless competence." He folds the paper precisely along its original crease and sets it to one side. "Do you know what Kingsman has survived in 100 years? Wars, governments, revolutions, the complete restructuring of the global intelligence apparatus 3 separate times. We survived all of it because we understood one thing that organizations like yours have never learned." He leans forward slightly. "Loyalty is not given to individuals. It's given to outcomes. The buyer of those codes is going to reshape a geopolitical balance that has been producing conflicts for 30 years. The codes are leverage, not weapons. They will never be used. They will simply exist in the right hands and make certain things possible that are currently impossible." He says it with the calm conviction of a man who has been carrying this belief for long enough that it has become, in his private architecture, something indistinguishable from principle. "You're rationalizing it," Ethan says quietly. "You know that." "I'm managing it," Arthur says. "There's a difference." He ease a single button on the underside of his desk. "I'm sorry about this," he says, and means it, Ethan thinks, in the specific way that people mean things that don't change what they've already decided to do. "So am I," Ethan says. He's already out of his chair before the door opens. Here's what activating every Kingsman agent in a building looks like from the inside. It doesn't look like chaos. That's the first thing to understand. Chaos is what you get from organizations that weren't built for this. Kingsman was built precisely for moments like this, moments when a threat is inside the perimeter and needs to be neutralized with minimum collateral disruption and maximum professional efficiency. What it looks like is the building getting very quiet. Doors closing, footsteps stopping, the ambient noise of a working institution cutting off with a precision that, if you weren't paying attention, you might mistake for coincidence. Ethan is paying attention. He's been paying attention since he sat down in Arthur's chair and felt the particular quality of the room tell him that Arthur's decision was already made before Ethan opened his mouth. He's been building the counterplan since then. 18 minutes of confrontation. 18 minutes of talking while another part of his brain was working through the building layout, the agent positions, the available resources, and the one variable that changes everything. "Danny, let's talk about what Ethan Hunt actually has right now. Because this is the part where the setup of the entire video pays off. Every detail, every observation, every piece of information filed away over 3 days of living inside this building. And it's worth laying it out clearly so you understand exactly how extraordinary what happens next actually is. He has his IMF equipment, hidden in modifications to his personal effects that survived Kingsman's intake sweep, because they were designed specifically to survive sweeps of this quality. 3 devices, a signal disruptor the size of a cufflink, a contact adhesive with a tensile strength rated for climbing, and a modified version of Kingsman's own concussive cufflink mechanism, reverse-engineered from his vault visit and built by Luther in a 4-hour window while Ethan slept. He has the building layout, every floor, every corridor, every room he's entered, and the 3 rooms he calculated the layout of without entering, based on the building's external dimensions versus its internal ones. 4 exits, 2 of which will certainly be covered, one of which requires passing through the kitchen, one of which, a maintenance access point on the east side of the building's basement level, appeared in a fire safety document he read during the drill on day 2, and which is almost certainly not in Kingsman's standard security protocol, because it was retrofitted in 1987, and the building's original architect didn't include it in the primary schematics. He has the vault knowledge, every Kingsman weapon he handled, examined, and cataloged, the umbrella gun's 2-second reset window, the Razor hat's telegraphed backswing, the concussive cufflink's non-directional blast radius, the shoe blade's activation motion, distinctive, requiring a specific chambering of the hip that takes a fraction of a second longer than a standard kick and can be read by someone who knows what to look for. He knows their weapons better, in some ways, than they do, because they know their weapons the way you know something you've always had. Ethan knows them the way you know something you've just taken apart and put back together. And then there's the thing that no amount of preparation, no amount of tactical intelligence, no amount of IMF engineering can give him. Danny. Ethan finds him exactly where he calculated he'd be, in the candidate's common room, which the alert hasn't reached yet because Kingsman's internal protocol correctly identifies the candidates as low-priority threats and high-priority collateral concerns. Danny looks up when Ethan comes through the door, moving at a pace that is not running, but is everything adjacent to running. He takes one look at Ethan's face. "How bad?" he says. "Arthur's compromised," Ethan says. "He's activated the building against me. I need 40 seconds of your help, and then I need you to get to the basement east exit and wait." Danny is on his feet before Ethan finishes the sentence. "What do you need? Do you know where the building's signal relay panel is?" "Maintenance corridor, sublevel 1, Danny says immediately. "I found it on day 2. It controls the internal comms between all the agent earpieces." Ethan hands him the signal disruptor. "You'll know which junction to attach it to," Ethan says. "When I need it, you'll hear me need it." Danny looks at the device, looks at Ethan. "Who are you actually?" he says. "Someone who's going to make sure you get out of this building," Ethan says. "That's enough for now." Danny takes the device, nods once, goes. The first Kingsman agent finds Ethan in the second-floor corridor, 40 seconds after he leaves the common room. He's good, better than good, the precision of his movement, the economy of it, the way he cuts off Ethan's most obvious lateral options before Ethan has fully committed to them. This is what Kingsman training looks like in real application. Not aggressive, not showy. Just relentlessly, elegantly correct. Ethan does something the agent isn't expecting. He stops moving laterally entirely. Kingsman's close quarters system is built around controlling space, cutting off angles, managing distance, steering the opponent through a series of positions that progressively reduce their options until there's only one left. It requires the opponent to move within a predictable range of responses. Lateral evasion, backward retreat, forward aggression. The system has counters for all of them, layered and rehearsed until they're instinctive. It does not have a built-in counter for an opponent, who simply doesn't behave like an opponent is supposed to behave. Ethan steps into the agent's space, closer than the system accounts for, inside the distance where Kingsman's techniques are calibrated to operate, and the agent's responses, elegant and precise and completely correct for every other opponent he's ever faced, are half a beat behind where they need to be for this one. 4 seconds, 2 movements, the agent is on the floor. Ethan keeps moving. The second agent comes from the stairwell with the umbrella deployed, bulletproof surface forward, dart mechanism active. The whole apparatus functioning exactly as designed as a mobile barrier that advances and controls space simultaneously. Ethan reaches into his jacket pocket. The contact adhesive, applied to his palm in a motion that takes less than a second, goes onto the umbrella's surface when the agent pushes it forward to drive Ethan back. The umbrella is now adhered to the wall behind Ethan. The agent has approximately 2 seconds to process what has happened before Ethan is past him. He uses the 2-second reset window, the one he identified in the vault, to make sure the dart mechanism doesn't fire while he's in range. Then he's through the stairwell door and moving down. Behind him, he hears the agent pulling at the umbrella, which is adhered to the wall with a compound rated for rock climbing, and is going nowhere for the foreseeable future. The third agent is Rupert. Of course it's Rupert. The universe of this mission has a sense of composition. Rupert in the corridor of the first floor, razor hat in hand, the specific backswing already beginning, and Ethan, who has been watching for exactly that hip-and-shoulder preparation since the vault, is already not where Rupert is throwing it. The hat takes a chunk out of the wall plaster that will require significant repair. Rupert switches to hand without missing a beat, which is the right decision and shows exactly how good he actually is underneath the performance of easy aristocratic superiority. They go 3 exchanges, Rupert correct and precise and textbook, Ethan completely unpredictable and uncomfortable to fight in the specific way that people who haven't followed a curriculum are uncomfortable to fight, because every response Rupert has been trained to deploy is calibrated for an opponent who is also following a curriculum. Ethan isn't following anything. He's improvising off a foundation of 20 years of staying alive in situations that were specifically designed to kill him. It doesn't look like any fighting system Rupert has ever trained against. It doesn't have the identifiable tells of any martial art or military combat doctrine. It looks, from the outside, like barely controlled chaos that somehow keeps producing the correct outcome. Which is, honestly, an accurate description. Rupert goes down on the 4th exchange. Ethan checks he's breathing. He is. Solidly, he'll wake up with a headache and a revised opinion of American operatives, and keeps moving. He's on the ground floor when the remaining agents, 4 of them, coordinating through their earpieces with the smooth efficiency of people who have drilled this scenario, begin converging on his position from 3 directions simultaneously. This is the moment where improvisation runs out, where 3 directions becomes a geometry problem with no elegant solution, where even Ethan's particular brand of creative chaos hits the wall of simple mathematics. 3 converging vectors, one of him, not enough space or time to address all of them before one arrives. He says one word. Not loud, steady, into the air of the corridor because the watch's microphone picks up a whisper at 10 meters. Now. And every Kingsman earpiece in the building simultaneously emits a burst of signal interference at a frequency that Luther calculated and Ethan verified against the vault's equipment specifications. Sits press. Selly at the threshold of the human auditory pain response. Not damaging, not permanent. Just for approximately 4 seconds, completely incapacitating. 4 seconds is enough. There's one more. Charlotte, in the basement corridor between him and the east exit, which tells him two things simultaneously. She knew about the exit, which means her intelligence background gave her the same building analysis he did, and she positioned herself here rather than with the other agents, which means she's been working a separate angle this entire time. She looks at him with the expression of someone who has been waiting for this particular conversation since the dinner fork hesitation on day 3. "You're not here for selection," she says. "Neither are you," Ethan says. A pause, both of them reading each other with the professional attention of people who do this for a living. "MI6, she says, not a question. "Close," Ethan says. Another pause. "Arthur," she says. The word carries the weight of someone who has been building a file of their own for longer than Ethan has been in this building. "He activated the building," Ethan says. "He'll do the same to you the moment this is over, whether I'm gone or not. You know that." Charlotte looks at him for a long moment. Then she steps aside. "East exit," she says. "There's a car, keys are in the visor." "You had an exit," Ethan says. "I had a contingency," she says. "There's a difference." She says it in a tone that is, if Ethan is not mistaken, and he very rarely is about these things, almost fond. He goes. Danny is at the east exit when Ethan comes through the door. Jacket on, ready, showing no particular surprise at any of what has apparently just happened above him, which tells Ethan more about Danny's composure than 3 days of selection tests managed to. They get to the car. Ethan finds the keys in the visor exactly where Charlotte said they'd be. Danny looks at the building as they pull away. The windows lit. The Savile Row frontage impeccable and unchanged, and giving absolutely nothing away about what has just occurred inside it. "What happens now?" Danny says. "Now," Ethan says, "we find where the transfer is happening, and we stop it." Danny says. "You found the signal relay panel in 2 days," Ethan says. "I need someone who reads buildings the way you do." Danny is quiet for a moment. "You still haven't told me your name," he says. Ethan pulls onto the street, London opening up around them, 34 hours left on the timeline. "Ethan," he says. Danny nods, looks ahead. "Right then, Ethan," he says, "where are we going?" Here's something nobody tells you about the final act of an impossible mission. It's never one problem. It's never the clean, singular challenge that the briefing implied: find the location, stop the transfer, neutralize the threat. That version of the mission exists only in the briefing room, where the people constructing it have the luxury of presenting information sequentially, and the profound disadvantage of not yet knowing what they don't know. In the field, in the actual, breathing, unpredictable reality of a mission in its final hours, it's always several problems, arriving simultaneously, from directions you didn't account for, requiring solutions that contradict each other in ways that would be almost elegant if the stakes weren't so catastrophic. Ethan knows this, has known it for 20 years, has built his entire operational philosophy around the certainty that the last 90 seconds of a mission will require him to solve something that wasn't on any briefing document ever written. He's driving through pre-dawn London with a former council estate kid he's known for 4 days, and an intelligence file that tells him where the arms dealer was 8 months ago. The clock says 34 hours. The reality, he suspects, is considerably less. They go to a location Luther has secured, a safe house in Bermondsey that smells of instant coffee and old carpet, and the specific utilitarian comfort of a space designed to be functional rather than felt. Luther is already there when they arrive, laptop open, 3 screens running simultaneously, the expression of a man who has been awake for 20 hours and is running on professional obligation and sheer accumulated stubbornness. He looks at Danny, then at Ethan. Ethan starts. "I don't need to know," Luther says. Then to Danny, "Can you read a network map?" "Depends on the network," Danny says. Luther turns one of the screens toward him. The arms dealer's network, reconstructed from the Kingsman archive photographs Ethan transmitted, combined with IMF's 8 months of peripheral intelligence that, assembled alongside Kingsman's central file, suddenly makes considerably more sense than it did in isolation. Danny studies it for 40 seconds. "The handoff location," he says. "It's going to be somewhere with guaranteed signal blackout. They'll want 0 digital F. Print on the transfer itself. And somewhere with multiple exit routes that don't intersect, so the buyer and seller can arrive and leave without ever being in the same documented place." He points to a section of the map, a cluster of connected assets, shell companies, property holdings, logistics fronts. "There," he says, "that's the one that fits both criteria." Luther looks at where he's pointing, types rapidly, pulls up satellite imagery. "A private freight terminal, south of the river. Operational, genuinely operational, commercial shipping moving through it daily, which means activity won't flag any surveillance algorithm looking for anomalies, because there are no anomalies. Just freight, just business, just the perfectly legal surface of something deeply illegal operating underneath it." "How did you?" Luther begins. "Council estates teach you to read who owns what," Danny says simply. "The names change, but the structure's the same." Ethan looks at Luther. Luther looks at Ethan. "I like him," Luther says. They have 12 hours, it turns out, not 34. The timeline moved again. Luther's network flagged a communication burst from the buyer's side that indicates accelerated preparation. The codes are moving tonight. Which means everything moves tonight. Ethan doesn't waste time recalibrating around the compression. Compression is a feature of final acts, not a complication. You work with what the timeline gives you because the timeline doesn't negotiate. They approach the freight terminal at 11 p.m. 3 people, Ethan, Luther coordinating remotely from the safe house, Danny on the ground because he asked to be, and because Ethan has learned in 4 days that Danny's instincts in unfamiliar situations are better than those of people who have had 3 times his training. The terminal is busy in the way that a terminal being used as a cover for a nuclear code transfer would be busy. A level of activity slightly elevated above what the shipping manifest would justify. The specific choreography of people who are performing normalcy rather than inhabiting it. Ethan reads it in 40 seconds. 12 operatives on the ground, 4 covering exits. The arms dealer present personally, which is either confidence or desperation, and Ethan will know which within the first exchange. The buyer's representatives, 3 of them, positioned with the defensive geometry of people who don't trust the seller and are prepared to leave fast if necessary. The codes themselves, in a case, biometrically sealed, sitting on a table in the freight terminal's central office with the specific unguarded quality of something that doesn't need to be guarded, because everyone in the room already knows what happens if you reach for it wrong. 3 things are going to go wrong tonight. Ethan doesn't know yet which 3. He never does. That's not how it works. He goes in anyway. The first thing is Charlotte. She's inside the terminal when Ethan enters. Already inside, already positioned, which means she's been here longer and running a parallel operation that neither he nor Luther knew about, and which has just made the geometry of the room approximately twice as complicated. She clocks him from across the space, with the expression of someone who is deeply unsurprised and deeply inconvenienced simultaneously. He gets to her in 90 seconds without alerting the room, a route that requires passing behind 3 shipping containers, through a narrow maintenance corridor, and under a security camera that Luther kills remotely for a 4-second window. "MI6, he says, quietly, confirming the conversation they started in the basement corridor. 6 months, she says. I've been 6 months building toward tonight. The buyer's representatives, Ethan says, you have something on them. I have everything on them, she says, which I am not sharing until I know what your exit plan does to my operation. My exit plan destroys the codes, Ethan says. Your operation survives. The buyer's representatives get taken by you, clean, attributable to MI6 in whatever way you need. She looks at him with the evaluating attention she's been directing at him since day 3. You have 30 seconds to convince me, she says. He takes 22. She nods. They have an alliance. The second thing is the case. The biometric seal, which IMF's intelligence described as a standard high-security transfer mechanism, openable by the seller's print to confirm authenticity before the buyer's payment clears, turns out to be a dead man's switch. Ethan discovers this when he's close enough to the central office to see the case clearly, and the specific configuration of its locking mechanism tells him, with the cold certainty of someone who has handled enough ordnance to read a mechanism at 20 feet, that opening it incorrectly doesn't just fail to open it. It destroys it. And destroying a case containing nuclear launch codes in a freight terminal in South London does not destroy the codes. It destroys the physical medium carrying them, which releases the digital component into a pre-programmed broadcast that sends them to every server address in the buyer's network simultaneously. The arms dealer hasn't just sold the codes. He's built a system where if the transfer is interrupted, the codes go everywhere at once. It's brilliant, it's monstrous, and it means that taking the case by force isn't an option. Ethan transmits the configuration to Luther in 12 seconds. Luther is quiet for a moment that contains, Ethan knows, the sound of extremely rapid calculation. I can write a signal interrupt, Luther says. It'll block the broadcast window, but Ethan, I need the case's frequency before I can calibrate it, and to get the frequency I need to be within physical range of the case's transmitter. How physical, Ethan says. 10 feet, Luther says. Ethan looks at the central office, the arms dealer, the 12 operatives, the buyer's representatives, the case on the table with its catastrophic contingency sitting quietly inside it. Give me 6 minutes, Ethan says. This is where Danny becomes essential in a way that couldn't have been planned or predicted, which is the only way that things which matter actually happen. Because getting Ethan to within 10 feet of the case requires a distraction significant enough to redirect every set of eyes in the central office, including the arms dealers, including the buyer's representatives, including the 4 operatives positioned specifically to watch the case and nothing else. A distraction that looks accidental, organic, the kind of thing that happens in a working freight terminal and requires immediate physical response from everyone present because the alternative is a visible crisis in a space that cannot afford visible crises. Danny, from his position outside the terminal's north loading bay, puts a forklift through the wall. Not dramatically, not violently, precisely the specific amount of structural contact required to produce a noise that demands response without causing actual collapse. A sound that every person in the terminal feels in their chest and turns toward instinctively because instinct in a crisis doesn't ask permission. 4 seconds of universal attention redirection. Ethan crosses the office in 3. Luther has the frequency in 2. The signal interrupt goes live in 45 seconds. The dead man's switch is blind. The third thing is Arthur. Of course it's Arthur. He's in a car outside the terminal. Ethan didn't know. Luther didn't flag it. Charlotte's 6 months of preparation didn't account for it. Because Arthur, compromised and cornered and running out of options, has come to manage the thing he can no longer manage from behind a desk. Danny sees the car, recognizes Arthur from the building, transmits the information in 2 words through the earpiece Luther rigged him with at the safe house. Black car. Ethan has 90 seconds before Arthur reaches the terminal's entrance, and the entire operational picture changes in ways that cannot be controlled. So here's what happens in 90 seconds. Ethan takes the case, not by force, by a sleight that involves the arms dealer's attention being directed at the sound of his own operative going down behind him, which was Charlotte, moving on her own timeline and her own 6 months of preparation, and producing exactly the right outcome at exactly the right moment without any coordination with Ethan because she didn't need coordination. She needed the opportunity. Luther burns the codes, the signal interrupt holding the dead man's switch blind, while the physical medium is overridden by a counter-sequence that he has been building in the safe house for the past 6 hours on the basis of the frequency data Ethan transmitted. The codes don't broadcast. They don't transfer. They simply cease. Every server address in the buyer's network receives a null signal where the code should be, and a trace package that will take MI6 approximately 3 days to fully exploit. Charlotte's 3 days, her operation, clean and attributable exactly as promised. Danny, who has been watching Arthur's car with the focused attention of someone who understands instinctively that the person in that car is the reason this mission exists, blocks the entrance with the same forklift, positioned with considerably more precision than its first deployment. At the moment, Arthur's driver attempts to bring the vehicle through. Arthur is contained, outside, with nowhere to go and nothing left to protect. The arms dealer is on the floor of the central office. The codes are gone. And Ethan Hunt is standing in a freight terminal in South London at 11:47 at night, breathing steadily, with the particular quality of stillness that arrives when an impossible thing has just been accomplished, and the body hasn't yet decided how to feel about it. 90 seconds. 3 problems. 1 outcome. The archive evidence reaches Merlin at midnight. Transmitted through a channel that Charlotte established, MI6 to Kingsman, official and documented and impossible to dismiss or reframe, along with a full account of Arthur's activation of the building, his protection of the arms dealer, and the decision logged 8 months ago that started all of this. Merlin reads it at his desk in the building on Savile Row. And then he sits with it for a long time in the specific silence of a man whose entire institutional loyalty has just been revealed to have been partially misplaced, and who is deciding, with the methodical honesty of someone who has always valued truth over comfort, what that means and what it requires of him. It requires everything, as it turns out. It requires the full weight of Kingsman's institutional machinery directed inward, at its own leadership, with the same unflinching precision it has always directed outward. Merlin has done harder things. Not many, but some. He picks up the phone. 3 days after the freight terminal. London has moved on, the way London always moves on, with the magnificent indifference of a city that has absorbed centuries of crises and revolutions and upheavals, and simply incorporated them into the texture of its ongoing life without breaking stride. The Kingsman tailor shop on Savile Row looks exactly as it always has, impeccable, unhurried, the leather and wood smell and the perfectly folded fabrics and the staff who will never raise their voice above a murmur. From the outside, nothing has changed. From the inside, everything has. Merlin meets Ethan in the fitting room on the ground floor, which is either a deliberate choice or a Kingsman instinct so ingrained it operates below the level of conscious decision, conducting important conversations in the space that is most essentially, most fundamentally what they are. He doesn't offer a handshake, doesn't open with acknowledgement of what happened at the terminal, or what happened in the building, or the 3 days of institutional reckoning that have occupied every senior Kingsman figure since midnight of the operation. He simply says, "We have a vacant name, and lets that sit." Ethan looks at him. "Galahad," Merlin says, "the position has been vacant for some time. We've been looking for the right candidate." A pause. "We've apparently been looking in the wrong places." He says it without irony, without the complicated dryness that Merlin usually deploys as a buffer between himself and direct emotional statement. He means it plainly and entirely, and the plainness of it is the most affecting thing about it. "Galahad," Ethan says. "The knight who sought what couldn't be found," Merlin says, "who pursued the thing everyone else had given up on, who was, depending on which version of the legend you follow, the only one who actually got there." He looks at Ethan with the direct attention of a man who has evaluated thousands of candidates and knows, with the certainty that only comes from decades of practice, exactly what he's looking at. It struck me as appropriate. Ethan is quiet for a moment. The fitting room around him, the building above and below him, 100 years of history and devotion and institutional loyalty that was real and meaningful and worth something, worth a great deal, even accounting for the corruption that had nested at its center and been removed now at significant cost. A name, a seat, a place in something that was here before him and would be here after him. He feels it, the same way he felt it standing in the vault listening to Merlin talk about what Kingsman gives its agents. The same deep, genuine, human pull toward the thing he has never allowed himself. Permanence, belonging, the particular freedom that comes not from having no ties but from having ties that hold. He feels it completely, and turns it down. Not quickly. Not with the deflecting efficiency of a man who hasn't thought about it. He takes the time the moment deserves, which is considerable, and when he speaks it's with the careful honesty of someone who respects the person they're talking to enough to tell them the true thing rather than the comfortable one. "You build something here that lasts," Ethan says, "a name that carries, a legacy that continues. An agent becomes Galahad and takes on everything every Galahad before them stood for." He looks at the room around him, at the wood and the fabric and the weight of institutional history pressed into every surface. "I understand why that matters. I think it might be the most valuable thing an organization like yours offers." "But," Merlin says, knowing there's a but, Kingsman's training master didn't get where he is by missing the shape of what someone is about to say. "But my organization burns my file every mission," Ethan says. "Every single one. I come back, they hand me a new briefing, and somewhere a device destroys every record that I was ever involved in the last thing. No legacy, no continuity, nothing that carries forward. A pause. I spent a long time thinking that was the worst part of the job. And now, Merlin says, now I think it might be the only kind of freedom I actually know how to trust, Ethan says. Belonging to something permanent, I'd be afraid of what I'd do to protect it, what compromises I'd make, what I'd decide was acceptable because the alternative was losing the thing I'd finally allowed myself to have. He meets Merlin's eyes. You just spent 3 days dismantling the damage done by a man who made that mistake. I don't want to be that man in 20 years. Merlin is quiet for a long moment. The room holds the silence in the way that old rooms hold things, with the patience of something that has absorbed more significant silences than this one, and will absorb more after. That, Merlin says finally, is either the most self-aware thing a candidate has ever said in this building, or the most elaborate way anyone has ever declined a job offer. Probably both, Ethan says. Something moves in Merlin's expression. Not quite a smile, too precise for that, too carefully managed, but something in the vicinity of one. The offer stands, Merlin says, indefinitely, if that means anything. It means a great deal, Ethan says. And means it, completely, in the way that you can mean something fully while knowing it changes nothing about the decision you've made. Danny is waiting outside the shop. Not because anyone asked him to be. He's been told his selection candidacy is being reviewed under the new Kingsman leadership, which is a bureaucratic way of saying that everything Arthur decided is being reconsidered, which is a careful way of saying that Danny's path into this organization is now considerably more open than it was 72 hours ago. He's been told this. He's acknowledged it. And then he's come and stood outside the tailor shop on Savile Row because Ethan is coming out eventually, and Danny has one question and would like the answer before that becomes impossible. He looks at Ethan when he comes through the door, takes in the expression which tells him without words everything about how the conversation inside went and what was offered and what was decided. Nods once. The nod of someone who understood this outcome before it happened. You're leaving, he says. I'm leaving, Ethan says. They stand on Savile Row in the particular quality of London afternoon light, gray and honest, and not trying to be anything other than what it is. You're going to be good at this, Ethan says. Not a comfort. A statement of observed fact, delivered with the precision of someone who has evaluated enough people in enough extreme situations to know the real thing when they've spent 4 days watching it. Danny looks at the shop behind them, at the window, at the reflection of the street in the glass. Tell me your name, he says. Your actual name, not Holloway. Ethan looks at him for a moment. In 20 years of operations, covers, and identities that he's worn and discarded and rebuilt, the answer to that question has been different depending on which file you pulled, which government you asked, which database survived the last round of IMF destruction protocols. But standing on Savile Row on a gray London afternoon, 3 days after a freight terminal and 4 days after a corridor conversation, that was the most honest 40 minutes he's had in longer than he wants to calculate. Ethan, he says, just Ethan. Danny nods, extends his hand. Ethan shakes it, and there's something in the grip, something in the specific quality of the contact, that carries the weight of 4 days and one impossible mission, and a friendship that existed in conditions specifically designed to prevent it from existing. Just Ethan, Danny says, right. He lets go. Goes back inside. The tailor shop door closes behind him. That particular sound, wood and brass and 200 years of careful engineering. A sound that is the building asserting its own permanence against the impermanence of everyone who passes through it. Ethan stands on the pavement for one moment. Then he walks away down Savile Row, not quickly, not slowly, with the particular unhurried momentum of a man who has somewhere to be and will get there by whatever route the universe provides. And the London afternoon absorbs him the way it absorbs everything, completely and without ceremony. In the monitoring room on the second floor of the Kingsman building, Merlin is watching 12 security feeds simultaneously. Standard practice, end-of-day review. His eyes move from screen to screen with the methodical efficiency of a man who has done this 10,000 times and finds in it, still, a particular satisfaction. The knowledge of what's happening in the spaces he's responsible for, the building's life visible in miniature across a dozen small screens. He reaches the exterior camera. Savile Row, the pavement outside, empty now, the afternoon crowd moving past, nobody stopping, the world conducting its ordinary business. He watches it for a moment longer than he watches the others. Then, to nobody in particular, to the room, to the screens, to the 100 years of history pressing quietly into every surface of the building around him, Merlin says, whoever he was. A pause, the screens, the empty pavement. He would have made a brilliant Kingsman. He moves to the next screen. The building continues.